In light of the recent news of the Nintendo Switch, I would just like to say that somebody better pick up that phone because I fucking called it when I was talking about the future of gaming console hardware long ago. But this video isn't about that. So, I want to ask, who's old enough to remember the great Sega-Nintendo war? And I mean old enough to have been there, not read about it or anything like that. I mean actually experienced it. I know that most of my viewers are younger and have experienced different console wars, like the Sony vs. Nintendo, or Sony vs. Nintendo vs. Microsoft, or the current Sony vs. Microsoft. Now, I'm going to make this very clear. This is from my own experience. Again, my own experience, because I'm very sure that yours will more than likely be different. When I was a kid in elementary school, starting with kindergarten in 1990 at the age of 5, I had an original Nintendo, but I didn't play it that much at the time, because I think I was too young and my hand-eye coordination wasn't as developed as it is now. It wasn't until I got a Sega Genesis and got into Sonic the Hedgehog is when I really got into playing games. I'm an only child, so my house was a one console per generation house. Those who are my age that had siblings usually had both the SNES and the Genesis. The funny thing is, when I was growing up, no one really cared about Sega versus Nintendo. There was no fights about what system was better. Granted, this was in the days before touchscreen phones and high-definition graphics, and it was before the internet was as widespread and accessible as it is now. We still had our imaginations, playing pretend games and role-playing and going outside on a regular basis. There really is a noticeable difference between when I was a kid and how things are for kids now, as I'm pretty sure my parents can attest to that as well. I will say that the marketing between the game systems was really fierce though. The Sega vs. Nintendo was really just a huge marketing push. That's all it was. None of my friends and classmates really cared about it. But they did seem to lean towards Sega, but never said anything negative about Nintendo. They were enjoyed about equally. Then Sony came in with the PlayStation and I began middle school in 1994. During this time the internet was becoming more widespread. DSL was coming up, most people had 54K dial-up. This is when I started to see some rivalries pop up. Because the Saturn pretty much flopped out of the gate, Sony was just able to really push hard for 3D game development and the use of CDs. So everyone was into the PlayStation. And it was actually Final Fantasy VII that really drove that home. Then Final Fantasy VIII was a huge thing because of 7. It was Sony that was really winning because of the CD-based technology and the developers flocking to it. It was practically a consensus that the Sony PlayStation was the system to have. That's when my house became a two-console house, as my uncle had a PlayStation 1 and my dad really liked it, so my mother got him one for his birthday. Sony had the better game library because of Nintendo's cartridge decision. And I think a lot of my N64 friends knew that because they didn't really say anything. But the kids with PlayStations would want N64s and the N64s wanted PlayStations. But there wasn't that much rivalry. However, Nintendo did dominate the playgrounds because of Pokemon. I even gave a friend of mine my old Game Boy and Pokemon Red after I got a Game Boy Pocket and kept my copy of Pokemon Blue. I think that's why there wasn't that much of a rivalry between Sony and Nintendo. While Sony had the third-party developers in the pocket with PlayStation, Nintendo had one of the most successful and marketable franchises in history on a platform they pretty much monopolized. Then came the Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube, and I started high school in 1999. My dad's PlayStation 1 has been long since dead, literally dead as it stopped working. DSL internet was the standard, but cable internet was creeping up as its replacement. Now this is where I really started to notice a rivalry between the systems. I talked to a guy that hated the Dreamcast for reasons unknown, saying that he would rather have two N64s than a Dreamcast. Another one was busy sucking the dick of Sony for the PlayStation 2. In fact, me and him wrote reports on the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox. While the teacher didn't say his name, he did get admonished for saying that something sucks without reason, as I saw the look on the guy's face, which was that of embarrassment. My report was the better of the two because of my objective standpoint, which compared the specs of both systems and their capabilities. During this time, I was more into the GameCube. I wasn't interested in the Xbox as there was no games that I wanted for it, and Metroid Prime sold me on the system. My dad and I got a PS2 and GameCube respectively for Christmas. My Dreamcast got little use around this time because Sega had conceded to Sony once again, as Sony curb stomped the teeth out of them. A friend of mine got an Xbox on the reasons that all of his other friends had PS2s or GameCubes, logic that made no sense to me, but this friend was never really a forward thinker. Then college came around at the end of 2003. Cable internet was the big thing and was everywhere. At least where I lived in Florida at the time. Some places only had DSL or dial-up. Out of my group of friends, there was 2 Sony fanboys, but I think one was a Sony fanboy as if a cow was born in a tree, then it's a bird. As well he favored Sony, it was lighthearted joking fanboyism. The other was more serious about it, but he was a huge JRPG fan and a giant weeaboo. But he also did more PC gaming than the rest of us. Because of my friends and I had at least 2 of the 3 systems, there was a harmony between them. No one system was favored. It was GameCube for Mario Party, Mario Kart Double Dash, and Smash Brothers. PlayStation 2 for JRPGs, fighting games, and platformers. Xbox for first-person shooters. Then the 7th generation came out in 2005. Microsoft's Xbox 360 came out swinging, gut-punching Sony and Nintendo by releasing a whole year before their systems. And somehow, I'm not sure how, but I have a theory on this that will come up later, all the fanboys came out whatever rock they were living under, and then the console wars really began. Xbox 360 is the better system, cried the Xbox lords. It's got the better online gaming atmosphere. PlayStation 3 is the better system, bellowed the princes of PlayStation. It has a cell processor and a Blu-ray drive. The Wii is the best system, hollered the Nintendo Knights. It's got motion. They couldn't finish that as they were hung by their Wiimotes and nunchucks by Sony and Microsoft themselves. But still, I never saw any of these fanboys out in the wild. They weren't fighting each other outside of GameStops across the nation. It was rare when you found a die-hard Sony fan screaming about how the Hexbox sucks, and there was usually something psychologically wrong with that person. There really was, and still isn't, a war to be had. Third parties knew that they wanted to make money, that they had to release their games on both the PlayStation 3 and the 360. Sony still had that JRPG market cornered though, with only a few slipping through the cracks. But the console wars never took place in homes, playgrounds, schools, or public settings, at least for me. They took place on the internet, which is where my theory comes into play. Throughout the video you heard me mention the developments of the internet. It's my theory that the internet is what actually created the console wars, as the internet allowed those that are like-minded to sit in echo chambers as they smell their own farts all day. But it's mostly kids that bicker about which console is better, or adults with juvenile mindsets. And the fighting is really just to justify their own purchase. Once you get older, you tend to realize that you don't actually care which system is better. You get the system which will have the exclusive games you want. Or you'll get all the systems because you like what all systems have to offer. But like I said in the beginning, this is all from my experience. And I'm sure that yours is going to be different. I know that my console war stories are on the blah side, as I can't recall anything interesting. But I would be interested if you have any stories from the console wars, so leave a comment below to share your story.